You know, today battles are fought and people take a life from a long distance and may never even see the face of the person whose life they take, but this is hand-to-hand combat. They have to see the look of death on the faces of those whose lives they take.
It certainly makes them the people who remain more committed to the ideals they fought for. Not that anything going today would be less committed, but you realize there's kinds of a cleansing here of the Nephite society, and the people that emerge are more pro-democracy. That element of Amlicites is now limited or gone largely.
You can also see, too, going along with that, their tremendous compassion, almost remorse, that you can see Mormon talk about there. Verse 26 of chapter 3. And in 1 year were thousands and tens of thousands of souls sent to the eternal world, that they might reap their rewards. There's such a sense of loss, as you were indicating, and I'm sure you just feel the anguish on the part of those who care so much for all people.
So at this point in the history, this terrible loss of life and warfare, it really does seem to humble the people. But at the end, the faithful anyway, but the end, rather than humbling them, it seems to harden them. What do you suppose makes a difference? Intriguing thought.
That's a good question.
Look at verse 3 of chapter 4. So great were their afflictions that every soul had cause to mourn, and they believed that it was the judgments of God sent upon them because of their wickedness and their abominations. Therefore they were awakened to remembrance of their duty, and they began to establish the church more fully.
Maybe that's the answer to your question, is that sometimes when we're converted due to these external forces, it's not as lasting. And so as you see this members or people beginning to live the principles of the gospel, their reason for doing it may not be ultimately the right reason. It's got to come from the Spirit, and you see them struggling with that.
And sometimes it can be warfare, it can be any kind of trial in life, a hardship that we go through. People, it either turns them to God or against God. And what makes the difference seems to be what they're made of before the trial comes. The people of the Nephites here had really been working hard to establish the church, and they were on firm ground before the trials came, and so it turned them to God rather than against.
Interestingly, we see both reactions here in chapter 4. We see verse 11 and some concern, but in verse 13 there's still a very strong believing portion.
We're in chapter
4, verse 13. It says, "Now this was a great cause for lamentations among the people," but then this positive note also, "while others were abasing themselves, succoring those who stood in need of their succor, such as imparting their substance to the poor and the needy, feeding the hungry, and suffering all manner of afflictions for Christ's sake, who should come according to the spirit of prophecy." So there is a positive undertone, too, in this.
There is, but back up in verse 10, as you say, what was problematic in part here is the end of the 8th year of the reign of the judges, and the wickedness of the church was a great stumbling block to those who did not belong to the church, and the church began to fail in its progress.
Missionary work.
I remember first year of my mission, teaching people, and they said, there's some Latter-day Saints down the street, and we know they're not keeping a couple of the laws. So why should we listen to you if you're people? And I thought, well, that's poor logic, but it brought home this verse to me very powerfully, that when the members of the church don't live up to what they're expected to, it impacts missionary work and all kinds of other church activities. So.
And Mormon had seen this. I think.
Yeah, he's writing from a perspective that really would have resonated. Yeah.
The great inequality, the church is polarizing. Then you have the verse 10 people that are a stumbling block, and then you have the verse 12 people that are being devout and continuing and trying to succor the poor and care for others. It's a scary time.
You know, I'm always intrigued when I read through this is to try to identify what it is that causes people to go one direction over the other. And consistent throughout the Book of Mormon, you see these statements that when you're starting to do very well, that you tend to hold on to the riches of the world. You want more of what the world has to offer. And I find in verse 6 there's just a little line in the middle of that verse which said they had obtained by their industry. They're talking about how all this wealth had come, and they've recognized that the reason they're so successful is because they've worked so hard for it, and that somehow that work has translated into I deserve it. And so instead of maintaining that humble view of the relationship that you have with God, and that this has come as a result of the blessings from God, it's coming because of my own hard work, and now therefore I deserve it, and I set myself up a little bit above those who may not work as hard as I do. It seems to be the similar challenges that we face in our society today.
That's interesting. You know, that really, I think, points to one of the important reasons why we pay tithing. I don't think we pay tithing because God needs the money, but people who pay tithing don't have to worry about their money becoming more important than God. If they do that, they seem to keep things in proper perspective, and you wonder if these folks were paying their tithing. We're surprised how fast things happen here. We start off the first year of the reign of Judges, chapter 1. Where are we now?
Well, we're probably about 8 to 10 years into the reign of Judges.
Talk about a decade loaded with change and turmoil.
Well, by the end of chapter 4, conditions are such in both the society and the church that Alma decides it's time for him to only wear one hat, to just be the high priest, the prophet, and so he makes arrangements to no longer serve as the chief judge.
So he's going to separate church
and state. Yeah.
And state. Yeah. I'm glad he decided to keep the hat of the church, and that's going to come in very beneficial when we look at these next chapters. But you just read this to your children in home evening. When it's all done, you want to give them the message, the take-home message. What you hope that will enter into their hearts. What would you, out of these 4 chapters, highlight?
Boy, there are a lot of principles being taught, and you seem to just kind of deal. One, I'd like to point out some of the challenges that faithful people have in the church. You know, almost immediately as Alma becomes the chief judge, the high priest, there's an onslaught of challenges, whether it's Nehor, whether it's the Amlicites, whether it's the battles that are taking place, the wages of war, or whether it's the internal conflict that's coming within the church and people establishing themselves with pride, and ultimately it's now, I'm going to go preach the gospel and we're going to try to put an end to some of this.
We admire Alma's courage. Thank you, gentlemen.